Hello guys, Pablo here. What we'll be doing now is creating a list of our projects using a user interface element called image lists. Image lists are similar to list view to what's known as list views in other platforms, and they don't necessarily have to contain images like you're seeing here. So we want to have that added onto our settings page. Let's begin by adding a new container which will be an empty image list. I'm creating it as an empty image list because we will populate this using JavaScript. We give it a unique ID of projects list. The data type needs to be image list, and it's not containing any images, and we want the remove buttons to be shown because we will implement those as well later on. Now, when do we want this to be initiated? In bbui.js, what's called the screens, the HTML fragments, are only loaded once you click on the corresponding tab, once you call for them. Every time that you open one of these screens, there's an event called onDOM_ready being executed. That event is being executed after the DOM is shown on the screen. So we want to get a hold of that event, and then we want to execute certain actions only when the screen that's being loaded is settings.html. So in our initialization code for the BB object, we are going to create a listener for onDOM_ready. You can find examples of these in here, and that's going to be a function which receives the DOM element of our screen, the actual div, the ID of the screen, and optional parameters. So let's start by just showing something on the console when this is loaded. onDOM_ready event, so that you can see what I mean by that event. That's going to be called, it's called at the beginning because we're loading track.html, and then every time I click on a tab, that's being loaded again. Now, how do I do it to only get certain actions executed only for a certain page? Well, that's very easy. Just use an if statement and check for the ID, which in our case is settings. Let's recall that in all of our pages, when we refer to settings, we enter an ID in here. That's the file name and that's the ID, so that's the name we're using. And when that happens, we wanna run this init settings method that I'll show you right away. We're gonna give it the element as well because we want to modify that element by adding elements to our list view. Let's recall that we want to add a header that says projects, and then we want to add all the existing projects with the client names below. Let's go to our main object. See that I created a method called init settings, and what's going to happen here might be a bit confusing at first, but it's actually very simple. We'll start by defining two variables. One of them will contain all the elements of the list, and the other one will be used to contain the current element of the list. Let's start by creating the header one. We create a div element in our document that's been stored here. We give it the data type of header. That's what you have to do to get that list header. The HTML is going to be projects, and we are adding that to our list. It's going to be the first element in our list. What we'll do next is iterate through all of our projects. Let's remember that this is where our projects are stored. we start from 0, we get the length of the array, and then we call these as many times as elements there are in the array. Now you might have seen this in a different way, like instead of using array len, they would just write this in here. But the problem with that is that then you're getting the length of the array on each step of the iteration, and that's consumes resources in your device. This is better practice, because then you only get that length once, and then that length then we're just calling the variable that stores the length. We're not calculating the length of the array on each step. Inside of this iteration, what we'll do is very similar to what we did in here, which is creating a new div. That's going to have a custom attribute called project ID. That's an attribute I've just created. It's not something that's part of the framework or anything. I'm just using that to store these values here. So I can't use ID because it has other meanings in HTML, so I just call it project ID, and I'm getting the ID of the current project in the iteration. After that, we are giving it the data type of item, just like we did with header in here. Now it needs to be called item, and the title is going to be the name of the project. And then there's an area, there's space for like a subheader. That's in the inner HTML. It's going to be the name of the client. And the last thing I'll do in this array is to actually push that item into the list of elements. And the last thing we'll do is get the element, the actual screen. We're going to select the projects list. Let's remember that that's the project list, the actual image list. So in here we're referring to the image list for the first time. So far we've created this in an abstract way, but now we are getting the actual image list, and we're using a method that these kinds of elements have, that image lists have. It's part of the API, to refresh it, and by showing the elements on the list. So if I didn't make any silly mistake, it should all be showing once I go to settings. Yeah, the buttons are being shown, but they don't have the functionality yet. That's something we'll look into right away. So let me summarize what we've done. We've created an empty image list. We've created a listener for the onDOM ready event, which is called every time a screen is pushed to the screen. But we only care about the settings one, so we're only executing this when the current screen is settings. And what we're doing when the current screen is settings is actually creating elements for that list, a header, and then items, and we're putting them all into the image list by refreshing it, and that allows it to be shown on the screen.